The artificial atmosphere of Nexus 7 crackled with electromagnetic storms, throwing dancing shadows across the battlefield. Commander Jocko Varon pressed himself against a twisted metal beam, his pulse rifle's scope highlighting movement through the settling debris. The Terran coalition forces had withdrawn 3 hours ago, leaving him to conduct the final sweep alone. Nexus 7 had been a trade hub once, its surface covered with gleaming towers and bustling markets. Now it resembled a broken skeleton, with support struts jutting from collapsed buildings like the ribs of some massive beast. Varon's enhanced visor painted the landscape in thermal gradients. Cooling wreckage showed as deep blue, while pockets of still-burning materiel glowed angry red. His orders were clear: extract any surviving coalition personnel and eliminate potential intelligence threats. The Astari refugees who'd been caught in the crossfire weren't his concern. They were non-combatants in a war that had already consumed 3 star systems. A sound made him freeze, soft, musical, yet filled with pain. It cut through the ambient noise of cooling metal and distant explosions like a silver thread. Varon's training told him to ignore it, to stick to his designated search pattern, but something in that sound pulled at him. He followed it through a maze of rubble, stepping carefully around unstable debris. His boots crunched on shattered glass that had once been windows, now scattered like frozen tears across the devastation. The sound grew clearer as he approached its source, a child's whimper, weak but persistent. Behind the wreckage of what had been a medical station, partially hidden by a fallen support beam, he found her. She couldn't have been more than 9 standard years old, her azure skin luminous, even covered with dust and grime. Crimson hair fell in tangled waves around her small shoulders, and when she looked up at him with eyes like molten amber, something shifted in Varon's chest. It was as if a wall he'd spent years building suddenly developed a crack. He'd seen Astari before in intelligence briefings, holographic images that didn't capture the subtle grace in their movements, or the way their skin seemed to catch and hold light. This child had that quality, even frightened and injured as she was. She spoke in her native tongue, the words flowing like water over stone. His helmet's translator struggled with the dialect, offering only fragments. Hurt, alone, afraid. She pointed to her leg where purple blood seeped through torn clothing. The wound looked bad, a deep gash that had probably been caused by flying shrapnel. Against every regulation he'd ever learned, Varon holstered his weapon and knelt beside her. "Easy," he said softly, removing his helmet so she could see his face. "I'm not going to hurt you." She flinched when he reached for his medical kit, but didn't try to run. Her small hands gripped a piece of fabric, the remnant of what might have been a toy or blanket. As he cleaned her wound with antiseptic foam, she watched him with those incredible eyes, alert despite her obvious pain. The smart bandage he applied would monitor her vitals and adjust its treatment accordingly. As he worked, she spoke again, pointing to herself with one trembling finger. "Zira," she said, the name like wind chimes in the still air. "Varon," he replied, tapping his chest. When she smiled, an expression so bright it seemed to push back the darkness around them, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. That smile saved both their lives. Imperial Reapers descended from the toxic sky with the whisper-quiet hum of advanced stealth systems. Their attack craft moved like hunting birds, sensors sweeping methodically for signs of life. Varon scooped Zira into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. He pressed them both deeper into the ruins as energy beams lanced through the air where they'd been standing moments before. The Reapers weren't interested in destroying everything. They were hunting for specific targets, information sources, Astari nobility who might have intelligence value. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Zira, though he wasn't sure she understood. She nodded anyway, burying her face against his shoulder. They moved through the wreckage like ghosts, Varon's military training serving them well. He knew how to read the patterns of destruction, which routes would provide cover, where the Reapers would expect to find survivors. More importantly, he knew where they wouldn't look. The old maintenance tunnels beneath Nexus 7 had been forgotten by most, but military engineers never forgot infrastructure. Varen had studied the station's blueprints during the approach, looking for exactly this kind of escape route. In an abandoned supply depot deep beneath the surface, he finally set Zira down. The space was barely larger than a closet, filled with emergency supplies that had expired years ago. But it was hidden, and it was safe. Zira was shivering, from shock, cold, or both. Varen gave her his emergency rations and watched her eat with desperate hunger. Each small bite seemed to restore a bit of her strength, and gradually the fear in her eyes began to fade. "Where are your people?" he asked gently. She tilted her head, not understanding the words but recognizing the question in his tone. She pointed upward, then made a gesture that might have meant gone or far away. Her lower lip trembled slightly. They waited in the darkness for hours. Varen checked his chronometer, 0347 standard time. The evacuation window had closed. Even if he could reach the surface, there would be no rescue ships waiting for him. Command had written off anyone still planetside as lost. But as if summoned by some unspoken prayer, new lights appeared in Nexus 7's poison sky. Not the harsh blue-white of Coalition vehicles, but something softer, more organic. Ships that moved with fluid grace descended through the atmosphere, their hulls shimmering with an opalescent sheen that seemed to bend light around them. A starry rescue craft. Varen gathered Zira in his arms again, wrapping her in his thermal cloak. They emerged from the tunnels to find the surface transformed. No longer a battlefield, but a landing zone where graceful ships touched down with barely a whisper. Figures emerged from the vessels, tall, ethereal beings with the same azure skin and crimson hair as the child he carried. They moved with purpose, spreading out to search the ruins with technology that made Coalition's sensors look primitive. One appeared before them so suddenly that Varen almost reached for his weapon. She was female, wearing armor that looked grown rather than manufactured, its surface shifting through subtle color variations. When she saw Zira, her composed expression cracked. She dropped to one knee, speaking rapidly in the Astari tongue. Her voice carried urgency, disbelief, and what sounded like overwhelming relief. "Star Child," she said in accented standard, looking up at Varen. "You carry the lost heir of the Crimson Fleet, the daughter of Queen Lyralee herself." Varen's mouth went dry. "Heir?" The woman, clearly some kind of officer or noble, bowed her head briefly. "I am Fleet Commander Thistra. In the name of the Astari Expanse, I offer you the gratitude of our people." She stood, her amber eyes intense. "How did you find her?" "I heard her crying," Varen said simply. Thistra translated this for Zira, who listened with growing excitement. The child looked up at Varen, her small hand touching his cheek with surprising gentleness. "Someday," she said in carefully pronounced standard, "Zira repay debt, promise." Before Varen could respond, Thistra was lifting the girl from his arms. Other Astari gathered around them, medical personnel who began treating Zira with technologies that seemed more art than science. "Your people will be informed of your heroism," Thistra said as they prepared to board their ship. "The Astari do not forget debts of honor." Zira twisted in Thistra's arms, reaching toward Varen. She spoke quickly in her own language, her voice urgent. "She asks your name," Thistra translated. "Your full name." "Jaco Varen," he said. "Commander, Terran Coalition, 3rd Fleet." Zira repeated it slowly, as if memorizing each syllable. Then she smiled one last time before they carried her away. The Astari ships disappeared into hyperspace with barely a shimmer, leaving Varen alone under Nexus 7's dying artificial sky. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence and wondering if he'd imagined the whole encounter. But the warmth on his cheek where her small hand had touched him felt real enough. 15 years swept past like dust across a solar wind. Commander Varen had become Farmer Varen, trading his pulse rifle for agricultural tools on the remote world of Verdania. The planet sat at the very edge of human space, where the stars grew sparse and the nights stretched long and peaceful. His homestead occupied a valley between rolling hills, covered with golden wheat that rippled in the constant breeze. He'd chosen this place deliberately. No neighbors for 50 kilometers, no spaceport within easy traveling distance. No regular patrols or commercial traffic. Just him, his farm, and the endless sky. The cabin he'd built with his own hands was simple but sturdy, constructed from local timber and powered by solar cells that tracked the movement of Verdania's small orange sun. The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, though it couldn't entirely banish the memories that surfaced in quiet moments. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled across the plains, he'd remember the sound of a child crying in the ruins. He'd wonder what had become of her, whether she'd survived the war that had raged for another 3 years after Nexus 7, whether she'd grown up safe in whatever palace or fortress the Asteri called home. Then he'd remind himself it didn't matter. She'd been a mission, nothing more. A child who'd needed help, which he'd provided according to his training and principles. The fact that she'd been some kind of princess was irrelevant. He'd done his duty, and that was the end of it. Except it never felt like the end. Thunder rumbled across Verdania's broad sky on what had started as a clear evening. Varan sat in his usual chair by the main window, nursing a cup of bitter caf while watching storm clouds build on the horizon. The weather control satellites for this sector had failed months ago, leaving the planet subject to natural meteorological patterns that had been dormant for decades. Lightning split the darkening sky, and rain began to patter against the reinforced transfer steel windows he'd installed as a precaution against hail. In the distance, he could see his wheat bending before the wind, and he made a mental note to check the grain bins in the morning. 3 deliberate knocks echoed through his cabin. Varen's head snapped up, calf forgotten. In 5 years on Verdania, he'd had exactly 0 visitors. His nearest neighbor was half a continent away, and the supply shuttles always announced themselves via comm system before landing. The knocks came again, patient, measured, too precise to be accidental. Years of combat training kicked in as Varen rose from his chair. He moved to the wall safe beside his bookshelf, retrieving the plasma pistol he'd hoped never to use again. The weapon felt heavier than he remembered, its grip worn smooth by years of use in another life. "State your business," he called toward the door, not moving from cover. Silence. Only the sound of rain growing heavier against his roof and the distant rumble of thunder. He approached the entrance carefully, checking the security display mounted beside the doorframe. The screen showed only darkness and driving rain, but the motion sensors indicated a human-sized figure standing directly in front of the threshold. Varen released the door's locks and opened it just wide enough to see outside. Standing in the downpour was a woman whose mere presence seemed to charge the air around her. Azure skin gleamed with rainwater, and crimson hair hung in wet ropes around her shoulders. She wore a traveling cloak that had seen hard use, its dark fabric plastered against her tall, elegant form. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. Molten amber, exactly as he remembered them, though now they held depths that spoke of years spent learning hard lessons. "Hello, Varen," she said, and her voice was exactly as he'd imagined it might sound when she grew up. Rich, confident, with just a hint of that musical quality all Asteri possessed. He stared at her for a long moment, his weapon forgotten. "Zira? May I come in? I'm getting rather wet out here." He stepped aside wordlessly, too shocked to form a coherent response. She entered with fluid grace, water dripping from her cloak onto his polished wooden floor. Those incredible eyes surveyed his simple home, the handmade furniture, the carefully tended plants, the absence of anything that spoke to his military past. "You found peace," she observed. "I found isolation," he corrected, finally remembering to close and lock the door. "How are you here? How did you find me?" She turned to face him fully, and he was struck by how much she'd changed. The frightened child was gone, replaced by a woman who radiated quiet authority. But underneath that composure, he caught glimpses of something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even vulnerability. "Finding people is what the Asteri do best," she said with a slight smile. "We have information networks that span the galaxy. When the last Crimson Princess vanishes into Coalition space, certain parties take notice." "Crimson Princess? One of my titles." She moved to his window, looking out at the storm-lashed fields. Though I prefer Queen, which is what I became 5 years ago when my mother died. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Her fingers traced patterns on the window's condensation. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the measure of a person wasn't how they treated their superiors, but how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. Varen set his pistol on the table, though he remained ready to grab it if necessary. Why are you here, Zira? It's been 15 years. Because I kept my promise, she said simply. I told you I would repay the debt. There is no debt. I did what anyone would have done. She turned from the window, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. That's where you're wrong. Not anyone would have saved an alien child in the middle of a war zone. Not anyone would have risked their life for someone they'd never seen before and would never see again. I thought I'd never see you again, he said quietly. But you hoped? The question caught him off guard. Had he hoped? In the lonely evenings when Verdania's moons cast silver light across his fields, had he found himself wondering about the blue-skinned girl with amber eyes? Sometimes, he admitted. She smiled, the first truly warm expression he'd seen from her. Good, because I never stopped hoping to see you again. Before he could process what that meant, her expression grew serious. Varen, the situation has changed. There are factions within my government that believe the Asthari should remain isolated from other species. They've learned about Nexus 7, about what happened between us. What does that matter? You were a child. I helped you. End of story. By our laws, what you did created a life bond between us. Usually such bonds are ritualized, controlled, made between compatible parties for political purposes, but ours formed naturally, spontaneously. She moved closer, and he caught the scent of rain and something else, something uniquely her. They believe that makes it dangerous. Dangerous how? Dangerous because it can't be controlled or predicted, because it represents change, and change is the one thing the Obsidian Sanctum fears above all else. Varen was about to ask who the Obsidian Sanctum was when new sounds filled the night. Not thunder this time, but the deep thrumming of engines cutting through the storm. Through his window, he saw lights descending through the rain. Too many lights, moving with predatory coordination. Reapers, Zira breathed, her hand moving to a weapon concealed beneath her cloak. I should have known they'd track me here. Track you? You led them to my home? I thought I'd covered my trail better. Her voice was tight with self-recrimination. They want both of us, Varen. They intend to use our bond as a weapon, control one of us to manipulate the other. Armed figures poured from the landed ships, their forms distorted by the rain and darkness. Even from a distance, Varen could see they carried military-grade equipment, energy weapons, sensor dampeners, restraint devices designed for capturing rather than killing. He grabbed his pistol, checking its charge. How many? Too many. Zira drew her own weapon, sleek, alien, humming with contained energy. Do you have any ships? Any way off-world? I gave up flying when I came here. Varen moved to another window, counting hostiles. My transport's a surface crawler, barely fast enough to outrun a storm. Then we fight our way out. With one pistol and whatever that is you're carrying? Against a squadron of Reapers? Zira's smile was sharp as a blade. You forget. I'm not the helpless child you saved anymore. The first energy bolt shattered his front window, sending glass cascading across his living room floor. The battle for Varen's homestead erupted with devastating suddenness. The Reapers came from multiple directions, their energy weapons turning his peaceful sanctuary into a war zone within seconds. Varen dove behind his overturned kitchen table as directed energy bolts seared the air where he'd been standing. How many? He shouted over the chaos. 30, maybe 40. Zira moved like liquid grace, her weapon cutting through the air in precise arcs. Where it struck Reaper armor, the advanced materials simply ceased to exist, leaving neat holes that dropped attackers instantly. Varen fired through a broken window, his plasma bolts finding their marks with the accuracy born of years of combat experience. but his weapon was older technology, less effective against modern armor. The Reapers pressed their advantage, advancing through rooms he'd spent 5 years making comfortable. "The workshop," Zira called out. "Is there another exit?" "Through the back." Varen rolled as energy fire scorched the floor where he'd been lying. "But they'll have it covered." A Reaper appeared in the doorway to his bedroom, weapon charging. Zira was there before Varen could even shout a warning, her blade taking the attacker's head off with surgical precision. Purple blood sprayed across the wall where he'd hung his only painting, a landscape of Verdania's hills under morning light. They fought through his home, past furniture he'd crafted with his own hands, beyond memories made tangible in objects chosen with care. In the kitchen, Varen's coffee maker exploded as a stray bolt caught it. His bookshelf toppled, spilling volumes he'd read and reread during long winters onto the floor. "The window!" Zira pointed to the large transparasteel panel that looked out over his garden. Without hesitation, she aimed her weapon at its frame. The molecular bonds holding the reinforced material dissolved, and the entire sheet tilted outward like a falling tree. They leaped through into the storm, landing hard in the mud of his vegetable garden. Rain stung Varen's face as they ran toward the tree line, energy bolts lighting up the night behind them. His tomatoes, the ones he'd been particularly proud of this season, exploded as displaced energy washed over them. In the forest beyond his fields, Zira led them along paths that seemed to shift in the darkness. She moved with certainty despite the rain and shadows, as if she could see things he couldn't. "This way," she called, pulling him toward a cluster of trees that looked exactly like every other cluster they'd passed. But as they approached, something shifted. The air itself seemed to bend, and suddenly there was a ship where moments before there had been only forest. It was smaller than he'd expected, built for speed and stealth rather than combat or comfort. "Adaptive camouflage," Zira explained, seeing his expression. "Astari technology. The ship bends light around itself, making it effectively invisible unless you know exactly where to look." They stumbled up the boarding ramp just as Reaper forces emerged from the tree line behind them. Energy bolts scorched the air around the ship as Zira's fingers flew over control surfaces that bore no resemblance to Coalition technology. The vessel lifted with stomach-wrenching acceleration that pressed Varen into his hastily found seat. Through a small viewport, he watched his home shrink to a flickering dot, then disappear entirely as they broke atmosphere. The silence that followed was profound. Only the soft hum of alien engines and the distant ping of navigation systems filled the air. Neither spoke for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Varen broke the quiet. "Where are we going?" "Kelthara," Zira replied without taking her eyes off the navigation display. "A neutral world. The Sanctum can't operate there openly. And what's to stop them from following us? Distance, diplomacy. The fact that Kelthara has defensive systems that make most military fleets think twice before approaching without permission." She glanced at him, and he caught that vulnerability in her expression again. "I'm sorry about your home. It was just a place." "No, it wasn't." Her voice was soft but certain. "It was your peace, your sanctuary, and I destroyed it by coming there." Varen studied her profile as she piloted them through hyperspace. The years had been kind to her. She'd grown into her mother's beauty, but there was steel underneath the grace now. Command had marked her in subtle ways. The way she held her shoulders, the unconscious authority in her gestures, the weight of decisions that showed in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "Why did you really come?" he asked. "The debt story. That's not the whole truth." Her hands stilled on the controls. For a moment, the only sound was the ship's gentle vibration as it rode the currents of hyperspace. "Do you dream, Varen?" The question caught him off guard. "What? Do you have dreams? When you sleep, I mean." "Everyone dreams." "I dream about Nexus 7, she said quietly. "I dream about a human soldier who saved a frightened child. I dream about amber eyes filled with kindness." She turned to look at him directly. "And sometimes when I'm awake, I wonder if you dream about me too." His heart rate quickened. "Sometimes. The bond between us. It's not just ceremonial. Over the years, I've felt connected to you, as if part of me was always aware of where you were, whether you were safe. She turned back to the controls, her cheeks flushed with color that showed even through her azure skin. The sanctum fears that connection because they can't control it. They believe it weakens me, makes me vulnerable to outside influence. Does it? In some ways, yes, she admitted. When I'm making decisions about war and peace, I find myself wondering what you would think. Whether a simple farmer who chose compassion over duty would approve of the choices a queen makes. Varen reached out, covering her hand with his. The contact sent a small electric thrill through him. Not alien technology, just the simple pleasure of touching someone he cared about. For what it's worth, he said, I think you turned out exactly as you should have. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. That may be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years. The navigation system chimed softly, indicating they were approaching their destination. Through the viewport, Calthera appeared, a world of crystal formations and silver beaches that caught and reflected the light of its twin stars. It's beautiful, Varen observed. It's also home to the largest refugee population in this sector, Zira said, beginning their descent. People from across the galaxy who chose freedom over stability, hope over fear. If anyone will understand what we're trying to build, it's them. As they descended through Calthera's atmosphere, Varen caught sight of the refugee camp that sprawled across the planet's northern continent. It was larger than he'd expected, not a temporary settlement, but a growing community with permanent structures and organized districts. How long have they been here? Some for decades, others arrived yesterday. Zira guided them toward a landing area marked with glowing beacons. Calthara doesn't turn anyone away, but it also doesn't provide more than basic necessities. People have to make their own way here. They touched down near a cluster of buildings that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape itself. As they disembarked, Varen was struck by the diversity of beings moving about the settlement. Humans, Astari, species he didn't recognize, all working alongside each other with an efficiency that spoke of long cooperation. A figure approached them across the landing field. Tall, androgynous, with skin that shifted through subtle shades of purple and gold in the strange light of Calthera's binary star system. They moved with fluid grace that reminded Varen of dancers he'd seen on Luna before the war. Your Majesty, the being said, bowing slightly to Zira, I am Thylos of the Wandering Fleet. We felt your arrival through our monitoring networks. Thank you for the welcome, Thylos. Zira's formal tone softened slightly. I request sanctuary for myself and my companion. Sanctuary is freely given to all who seek it, Thylos replied. Then their attention shifted to Varen. But you bring more than just yourselves, don't you? You bring possibility. I'm not sure I understand, Varen said. Thylos smiled, an expression that transformed their entire demeanor. Word travels fast in refugee communities. The story of the human soldier who saved an Astari princess has become something of a legend. Some say it proves bonds can form between species without conquest or domination. It was just the right thing to do, Varen protested. Exactly, Thylos said softly. That's what makes it remarkable. The refugee settlement on Calthara was a study in organized chaos. Beings from dozens of worlds had found sanctuary here, creating a community that defied conventional government structures. There were no formal laws, no central authority, yet somehow it all functioned. Thylos led them through winding streets that had been carved from the living rock of the planet itself. Buildings grew from the crystal formations like exotic flowers, their surfaces reflecting the twin suns in shifting patterns of color. We've prepared quarters for you in the diplomat's quarter, Thylos explained as they walked. Separate rooms but connected by a common area. Many of our residents prefer such arrangements when they arrive in pairs. Varen caught the subtle emphasis and felt heat rise in his cheeks. We're not together in that way. Of course not, Thylos agreed with a slight smile that suggested they didn't believe him for a moment. Their accommodations were simple but comfortable. 2 bedrooms flanking a common sitting area with a small kitchen. Large windows looked out over the settlement's main square, where beings of all species mingled freely. As evening fell over Kelthera's strange landscape, Varen found Zira on the small balcony attached to their quarters. She stood motionless, hands resting on the crystalline rail, staring up at the unfamiliar star patterns. "Regrets?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "About leaving my throne?" "Hardly." She glanced at him sideways, and he caught that hint of vulnerability again. "About involving you in this mess? Constantly. I'm exactly where I want to be." "Are you?" She turned to face him fully, and the twin moons of Kelthara cast her skin in silver highlights. "You had peace, Varen. A quiet life away from wars and politics and all the things that make civilizations tear themselves apart. Now you're a fugitive in exile because of decisions I made." "No," he said firmly. "I'm here because of decisions we both made. You chose to honor a 15-year-old debt. I chose to help you fight back when the Reapers came. Neither of us was forced into anything." She was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the alien moonlight. "On Astari worlds," she said softly, "bonds like ours are sealed with a ceremony called the sharing of stars. Two people pledge to walk the same path regardless of where it leads, to stand together against whatever darkness they might face." His heart rate quickened. "And what does that involve?" "Usually, a lot of formal ritual, political negotiations, contracts specifying property rights and inheritance laws." Her smile was rueful. "Rather unromantic when you get down to it." "We're not on an Astari world," Varen pointed out. "No," she agreed, stepping closer until he could see individual gold flecks in her amber eyes. "We're in a place where two people can choose their own path without anyone else's permission." The space between them seemed to crackle with energy. Varen was acutely aware of her proximity, the way the moonlight caught in her crimson hair, the subtle scent that was uniquely hers, the way her breathing had quickened slightly. "Zira," he began, then stopped. What was he supposed to say? That he'd thought about her for 15 years? That somewhere deep in his heart, he'd never stopped being the soldier who'd saved a frightened child? That looking at her now made him feel things he'd forgotten were possible? She solved his dilemma by rising on her toes and kissing him. Her lips were soft, warm, tasting faintly of the exotic fruit they'd shared at dinner. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper as years of wondering crystallized into present reality. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "So," Varen said, his voice rough with emotion, "what happens now?" "Now," Zira replied, her hand finding his, "we build something worth protecting." 3 months passed on Kelthera, like pages from a book Varen had never expected to read. The refugee settlement transformed around them, growing from a simple sanctuary into something approaching a small nation. Ships arrived daily carrying those who'd heard rumors of a place where species worked together without hatred or fear. Varen found himself drawn into the community's organizing efforts almost by accident. His military background proved valuable in planning defensive positions and training volunteer security forces. More surprising was how naturally he took to the diplomatic aspects, mediating disputes between groups with radically different cultural backgrounds, finding compromises that satisfied beings whose very thought processes operated on different principles. Zira threw herself into larger-scale politics, reaching out to sympathetic factions across known space. The small communications center in their quarters became a hub of interstellar diplomacy as she built networks of support among those who shared their vision of a galaxy where cooperation trumped domination. In the evenings, they would walk together through the settlement's crystal gardens, talking about everything and nothing. Varen learned about Astari history, their complex family structures, the weight of expectations that had shaped Zira's entire life. She listened to his stories of growing up on a farming colony, his years in the coalition military, the simple pleasures of working with his hands. Their relationship deepened gradually, naturally. Stolen kisses in shadowed alcoves, hands that lingered when passing documents. The comfortable silence of two people learning to be partners in all senses of the word. But the peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. Long-range sensors detect a massive fleet approaching, Thylos reported during their weekly council meeting. The gathering included representatives from all the major refugee communities, a rainbow of species united in their desire for something better than the galaxy's endless conflicts. How massive? Zira asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Over 800 vessels. Configuration suggests Obsidian Sanctum forces backed by coalition support ships. Thylos's expression was grim. They'll arrive within 72 hours. Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. 800 ships was enough firepower to reduce Calthera to molten slag within minutes. Even counting every refugee vessel that could mount weapons, they couldn't field more than a tenth of that force. Evacuation protocols? Asked Commander Wraith, a grizzled human whose ship had joined them 6 weeks prior. We could scatter the population across... No. Zira's voice cut through the growing discussion like a blade. Running solves nothing. They'll hunt us down one ship at a time, and eventually we'll have nowhere left to go. Then what do you suggest? Thylos asked. Zira stood, her hands resting on the table's crystal surface. In the weeks they'd been on Calthera, she'd changed. The weight of leadership she'd carried as a queen had evolved into something different. Not the authority of birth and tradition, but the respect earned through shared sacrifice and proven judgment. We fight, she said simply, not for territory or resources or ancient grudges, but for the right to choose our own future. Your Majesty, Commander Wraith said carefully, with respect, mathematics doesn't care about moral authority. 8-to-1 odds are better than the odds my people faced when we first left our homeworld, interrupted an elderly being whose crystalline exoskeleton marked her as one of the Cyrillan refugees. Sometimes the choice isn't between victory and defeat. Sometimes it's between dying free and living in chains. Others voiced agreement, the sentiment spreading through the room like a wave. These were beings who'd already lost everything once. Homes, families, entire civilizations in some cases. They'd come to Calthara not because it was safe, but because it was the only place where they could be themselves without apology. If we're going to do this, Varen said, standing beside Zira, we need to be smart about it. We can't match their firepower, but we don't have to. We just need to survive long enough to show the galaxy what we're really fighting for. An idea was taking shape in his mind, something born from the conversations he'd had with refugees from across the stars, stories of oppression and resistance that followed similar patterns regardless of species or technology level. The Sanctum wants to make this about restoring order, he continued, about putting down a rebellion of misfits and malcontents. What if we made it about something else entirely? Thylos leaned forward, interested. Explain. Every ship in that approaching fleet has a crew, beings who've been told we're dangerous criminals threatening the stability of their governments. But what if they could see what we've actually built here? What if they could watch cooperation in action instead of just hearing about it in propaganda broadcasts? You want to broadcast the battle? Commander Wraith asked incredulously. Turn it into some kind of performance? Not a performance, Zira said, understanding immediately. A demonstration. Show them that beings from different worlds can stand together, sacrifice for each other, work towards something larger than individual survival. And if it doesn't work? The Cyrillan elder asked. If they see everything we built and still choose to destroy it? Zira's hand found Varen's, their fingers intertwining. Then at least we go down fighting for something worth dying for. The next 72 hours transformed Calthera from a peaceful refugee settlement into a fortress preparing for siege. Ships were armed with whatever weapons could be found or fabricated. Communication arrays were reconfigured to broadcast on every major galactic network, and defensive positions were established among the crystal formations that dotted the planet's surface. Varen found himself appointed as overall military coordinator, a role that felt both familiar and strange. He'd commanded battles before, but never like this. Never with volunteer forces made up of families, farmers, merchants, and dreamers who'd never trained for war, but were willing to die for the possibility of peace. The Void Dancer served as their flagship, a mid-sized vessel that had once been a luxury yacht before its owner fled political persecution. It wasn't much to look at. Elegant lines marred by hasty weapon installations and armor plating, but it would have to serve. Fleet status report, Varen requested as they approached the edge of Calthera's system. 137 vessels operational, reported Lieutenant Kim, a young coalition defector whose ship had joined them just days before the Sanctum arrived, ranging from single-person fighters to converted cargo haulers. Armament varies wildly. Some ships are barely armed, others are carrying enough firepower to take out a dreadnought. Through the main viewer, space appeared empty except for the distant glitter of stars. But the sensors told a different story. Enemy contacts approaching in perfect formation, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds. Broadcasting status, Zira asked from the command chair beside his. All networks active, Thylos confirmed from the communication station. We're transmitting on standard diplomatic frequencies, civilian entertainment channels, even military command frequencies. Anyone with a functioning receiver will be able to watch. Zira activated the fleet-wide channel. All ships, this is Queen Zira of the Astari Expanse. Today we face an enemy that seeks to preserve order through oppression, unity through fear. They see us as rebels, terrorists, threats to their carefully maintained systems. Her voice carried clearly through the comm, steady and confident despite the impossible odds they faced. They're not entirely wrong. We are a threat to their certainty, to their rigid hierarchies, to their belief that sentient beings are too dangerous to trust with freedom. Today we prove them right to fear us. The enemy fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a display of overwhelming force that sent shivers through the sanctuary vessels. 800 ships in perfect formation, dreadnoughts, destroyers, fighter carriers, all bearing the black and silver insignia of the Obsidian Sanctum. Instead of immediately attacking, the sanctuary fleet scattered according to plan. They'd studied Calthera's crystal formations for weeks, learning how the structures could bend and focus energy in unexpected ways. Now those formations became part of their defense network. The first exchange of fire illuminated space like a miniature star being born. Energy beams crisscrossed the void in deadly patterns while fighters danced between capital ships like lethal insects. On screens across the galaxy, beings watched unprecedented cooperation as human pilots protected Astari vessels, while alien technologies shielded coalition defectors. But the math was inexorable. For every Sanctum ship that fell, 2 or 3 sanctuary vessels were destroyed. The broadcast frequencies carried images of devastating beauty, ships exploding in cascades of light, the geometric perfection of formations breaking apart under enemy fire, the chaotic ballet of spacecraft locked in mortal combat. On the Void Dancer's bridge, alarms blared constantly. Forward shields at 30%, Kim reported. We've lost contact with the Wandering Star and the Bright Hope. Varen gripped his chair as the ship shuddered under enemy fire. Beside him, Zira coordinated defensive patterns with an efficiency that spoke of natural command ability. Through their viewport, he could see the enemy flagship, a massive vessel painted in the black and silver of the Sanctum, its weapons cutting through smaller ships with ruthless precision. The Obsidian Crown, Zira identified, her voice tight. High Magistrate Korath's personal command ship. Can we reach her? If we can get close enough. But that thing has enough firepower to... Incoming transmission from the enemy flagship, Thylos interrupted. Audio and visual. On screen. The main viewer shimmered, then resolved into the image of a woman whose very presence radiated cold authority. Her pale blue skin was almost white, and her gold hair was pulled back in an intricate style that emphasized her sharp features. Behind her, the bridge of her ship was a study in intimidation. Dark surfaces, harsh lighting, crew members who moved with mechanical precision. Zira of the Starborn line, she said, the name dripping with contempt. I am High Magistrate Korath of the Obsidian Sanctum. You will surrender immediately and submit to judgment for crimes against the natural order. The natural order, Zira's voice carried dangerous calm. You mean the order where Astari consider themselves superior to all other species? Where fear defines policy and isolation is mistaken for purity? I mean the order that has kept our people safe for millennia, Korra snapped. The order you threaten with your reckless bonding to inferior species. Look around you, Zira gestured to the ongoing battle visible through the viewport. Do these beings look inferior? Do their sacrifices for each other seem like weakness? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Korra's features. The broadcast was carrying everything. The conversation, the battle, the sight of different species covering each other's retreat despite having no formal military hierarchy to command such cooperation. Propaganda, Korra said, but her voice lacked conviction. You've trained them well. I haven't trained them at all, Zira replied. They choose to stand together because they've seen what's possible when beings trust each other instead of fearing each other. The transmission cut abruptly as the Obsidian Crown fired a devastating barrage that vaporized 3 sanctuary ships in seconds. But across the galaxy, on worlds both Alliance and independent, beings were watching. They saw refugees fighting with military precision. They saw cargo pilots risking their lives to rescue enemy survivors. They saw what cooperation looked like when it wasn't imposed by law, but chosen freely. The tide of battle began to turn, not through superior firepower, but through something unprecedented. Individual ships in the Sanctum fleet began powering down their weapons. First one, then dozens, then hundreds as crews who'd been told they were fighting terrorists realized they were actually attacking refugees whose only crime was believing in a better future. What's happening? Varen asked as enemy fire slackened noticeably. They're switching sides, Kim reported, her voice filled with wonder. Reading mass defections across their entire fleet. Ships are refusing orders. Some are actively targeting their former allies. On the view screen, Korra's face had gone pale with rage and disbelief. Traitors, she screamed at her own bridge crew. You swore loyalty to the Sanctum. We swore loyalty to our people, came a response from one of the defecting ship captains. And these are our people, all of them. The reversal was swift and decisive. Within minutes, Korra's massive fleet had been reduced to a handful of ships, still loyal to the old ways. The Obsidian Crown found itself surrounded by vessels that had moments before been part of its own formation. The final confrontation came not with the roar of weapons, but in a moment of perfect silence as 2 fleets faced each other across the void. One representing the fear of change, the other embracing the uncertainty of growth. This isn't over, Korra transmitted, her voice shaking with fury. The Sanctum will never accept this perversion of natural law. Then the Sanctum will find itself increasingly alone, Zira replied calmly. Change isn't something that can be stopped, only directed. We're choosing to direct it toward cooperation rather than conquest. The remaining Sanctum ships activated their hyperdrives, vanishing into the void. But the damage to their cause was irreversible. Across the galaxy, the broadcast had shown millions of beings what was possible when fear gave way to trust. In the aftermath, as rescue operations began and the reality of their survival set in, Varen and Zira stood on the observation deck watching recovery efforts. The cost had been enormous, nearly half their fleet destroyed, hundreds dead, but something unprecedented had emerged from the wreckage. Was it worth it? Varen asked quietly. Zira leaned against him, finally allowing exhaustion to show through her composed facade. Through their bond, he felt the complex mixture of grief, hope, and determination that warred within her. Ask me in 50 years, she said, when children who never knew the old prejudices have grown up, when cooperation between species is so common that nobody thinks twice about it. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as beings from dozens of worlds worked side by side to clear debris and tend to the wounded. The galaxy felt different now, not like a collection of isolated territories, but like a vast community just beginning to discover its potential. What happens now? Varen asked. Now we build, Zira said, turning in his arms to face him. Not an empire or a hegemony, but something new. A confederation where worlds choose to work together because they want to, not because they're forced to. And us? Her smile was radiant. Us? We learn what it means to love someone completely while fighting for something larger than ourselves. We find a home, maybe on Calthera, maybe somewhere else entirely. We discover whether two people from different worlds can build a life together that honors both their pasts and their dreams. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, no longer separated by the arbitrary boundaries of suspicious governments. The war was over, but the peace, more complex, more challenging, infinitely more rewarding, was just beginning. Varen kissed her then, surrounded by the wreckage of old certainties and the promise of unlimited possibilities. In that moment, the debt that had brought them together transformed into something far more powerful, a choice to build a future together, one shared moment at a time. The crimson binding that had begun with a child's tears and a soldier's compassion would become the foundation for something extraordinary. A galaxy where beings stood together not from fear or law, but from the simple recognition that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart.